Hi, I've been gone for a bit, specifically a year and a half and then maybe some more, but here are two things that happened while I was gone. First, one of my videos suddenly started to get a lot of views. Or at least what I would consider a lot of views. And see, that should have been exciting until something started to happen. Look, at first this wasn't too bad. But then it started to get bad. Since I didn't know the answer to that question, I didn't do anything. Not for another year and a half, and then maybe some more. Not until right now, because I think I might know the answer to this question. Or at least that's what I'll be exploring today. So hopefully in the journey that we take, I'll be able to figure out a little more about why I wasn't able to post anything. Before we do that, here's a story about a little cat I know. Let's call her Chicken. Chicken loves chicken, beef, playing with felt balls, and laying in the sun. She also loves staring out of the window, watching birds, and getting belly rubs. But what she loves most of all is to zoom. Not that zoom, this kind of zoom. She's a connoisseur of zoomies and loves to run, hop, and jump, but this wasn't always the case. See, when I first adopted Chicken, she looked a little different. In the span of 3 days, she'd been brought into the shelter heavily injured, changed shelters, got spayed, and had one of her hind legs amputated because of how injured it was. And on the final day of those 3 days, I adopted her, which by the way, I was shocked too, and I had to really ask the adoption people, are you sure I should be taking her home right now? She looks very much like she needs to heal a little, and they assured me that it was all good. So not only did Chicken have to learn how to live with random long-legged creatures who were obsessed with her, but she also had to learn how to navigate the world with only 3 legs, something that she wasn't used to doing because she was born with all of her legs. And she also had to wear a cone on her head for 3 weeks while this was going on. And she was also in a completely new area, so all these factors could not have been easy. Initially, Chicken was pretty bad at walking. She would fall over, underestimate distances, and overcorrect with her turns. Like she wouldn't pivot the way she needed to pivot. Over time, she understood how to hold her body, how to navigate the world with only 3 legs, and now she's a little track star. But how was she able to do this? And why couldn't I do something far easier, like make a YouTube video on something I'm interested in? To find the answers I'm seeking, let's turn this conversation to the very professional I'm speaking about. Hi Chicken, do you have any insight on why I'm struggling with this? And you don't feel the same way? Do you think you might have any answers for what I'm struggling with? That's a good question. I wonder if it's always been this way. Good idea. And that's what we'll do next. Historically, people have learned skills by watching, shadowing, and following. People were often apprentices or worked in spaces that they were interested in before becoming experts in those fields themselves. Oftentimes, people also went to schools to become qualified in that. Then with the advent of industrialization and global trade, things changed a little. College and trade schools became a lot more popular, and there definitely became more of a focus on very specific classes at schools that were deemed as having more of an economic value than those that didn't. As we became more and more industrialized, the cost of living increased, and so did our need to become perfect. In fact, this kind of environment totally changed the way we approached our hours and our time in general. Author Jenny Odell, in her book How to Do Nothing, says that under capitalism, we're forced to think of our days being made up of 24 potentially monetizable hours. Even those of us who might be a little more economically privileged than people who would have to work multiple jobs. And in her words, time becomes an economic resource that we can no longer justify spending on nothing. So hobbies require time, and depending on the hobby, even if it's free or affordable, that becomes a little difficult. And now even in cases where the hobby might be free or incredibly affordable, because we think of time as an economic resource, it may still be hard not to see your free time as money either. Now let's say that this hobby was free and affordable for you. You would still think of it as expensive because of the way time is now being framed as an economic resource. And so since you're spending time doing that with the only outcome being personal satisfaction and enjoyment, which in a capitalistic society is not enough valued output, you would consider that time as being wasted and therefore that hobby as being expensive because you're spending the very limited economic currency of your own time on it. Now if that, what I just talked about, seemed awful, don't worry, it gets worse. Over the past decade, things like hustle culture have invaded almost every conversations about productivity, to the point where now if you're even remotely good at something or enjoy doing something and mention it to someone, they might even say, have you thought of monetizing that? Have you ever thought of selling that? Have you started thinking of opening an Etsy store? And if you're really funny and personable at all, people will even tell you, have you considered starting a YouTube channel or a TikTok? Because every form of you can be capitalized, from your economic output to also your personality. Anyway, it's also in these times where our ability and our moments of joy intersect that we often ask ourselves, should I try to make money off of this? Like sometimes people will see Chicken, my cat, and even tell me I should start an Instagram or a TikTok for her. Not necessarily because other people would like to see her, but mostly because they're like, you could make money off of her. People would watch her, which would guarantee you some money. People are like, make her pay that rent, which I totally understand. I totally understand getting the bag, but it is interesting to ask ourselves, why is our first reaction to always be like, oh, how can I make a bag? Actually, I know the answer. It's because the cost of living is just getting more and more expensive. And that's the answer to this whole video. It's almost like financial gain has become our entire goal. If we're good at something, we should find a way to make money off of it. And if we love doing it, we should definitely try to make money off of it. What's that saying? If you do something you love, you never work a day in your life. I think the real question we need to be asking is, why do we need to turn everything we love into an economic pursuit? Molly Conway, a playwright and writer, in her article, The Modern Trap of Turning Hobbies into Hustles, said, and I will be quoting, "It's no surprise we feel pressure to monetize our spare time. The cult of busyness is one of the most toxic aspects of our culture, but it's also a defense mechanism. When so many of us are suffering economic hardships as we struggle to put our education and potential to use amid the 5 alarm fires of climate change and political turmoil, it's easier to stomach needing 3 jobs to make ends meet if we rebrand ourselves as hustlers. So we pour ourselves another cup of coffee, post an inspirational meme, and abide by the national motto of rise and grind, ever on the search for a new hack that will help us get more done in less time." This incessant pressure of hustle culture to create something and monetize what you're good at breeds increased competition between the people participating in it. Because if you can't be the best, how can you survive and make any profit when there's so many people like you doing the same thing? If you're going to make art, you better become the best artist that there ever was so you can monetize it and make a living off of it. If you're doing TikTok or YouTube, you better have the perfectly curated and made YouTube video and TikTok out already so that you can become one of the best people doing it and therefore monetize it. We don't really allow ourselves to be imperfect at all, because if we're imperfect, how can we compete with other people when all of us are trying to make a living? When we're doing a hobby, we're not really allowed to be in the developmental stages at all. Perhaps that's why I couldn't do YouTube for so long. Every idea felt bad, every video felt poorly done, and every time I spoke, I feel like I didn't quite capture what I wanted to. And maybe due to the pressure of this competition, I was super unaccepting of the fact that I was in the developmental stages of my own hobby, which was doing YouTube. I'm not sure if this way of thinking is too sustainable, because in Molly Conway's words, if we choose to capitalize on all of our resources, when do we get to choose ourselves, our own enjoyment? I I think there's another contender who is related to it and definitely has been caused by it, but is also further propagating this way of thinking, and that is perfectionism. Under the competitive ideology of capitalism, where you can only succeed by being the best, meritocracy is the way to go, or at least that's what's advertised to most of us. Now, what is meritocracy and how does it even relate to perfectionism? Meritocracy is a belief that individuals are rewarded and can get ahead based on their individual efforts, abilities, and outputs. That is, our merits, or the way we perform, is the key to achieving success under capitalism. Now, most of us have been raised with the idea of meritocracy. Study hard enough, you'll get good grades. You get good grades, you get to go to a good college. You get to go to a good college, you get a good job. You get a good job, you be a good employee. If you become a good employee, you'll get a promotion at work. If you get a promotion at work, you're able to afford all the things you've ever wanted. Work hard enough, you'll be successful. And hey, you might even become a billionaire too, because it's totally not like most of them came from money already. Being raised with this kind of ideology has bred a culture of perfectionism. After all, if our skills and our output equate how successful we become and how far we'll go in society, why not be hyper aware of everything you do? Isn't perfectionism not just the best tool for capitalistic success? If every single person who's working is always terrified of being the best and constantly doing the best work that they can because they think it'll help them earn a lot of money, there's going to be a lot of really good quality output out there. A study on perfectionism and how it increased over time, specifically from 1989 to 2016, Thomas Curran, an associate professor of psychological and behavioral science at London School of Economics, and Andrew P. Hill, a professor of motivation and personality at York St. John University, found that in the over 40,000 students in the UK, US, and Canada who they observed, they found that recent generations of young people are more demanding on themselves, perceive that others are more demanding of them too, and are in themselves also more demanding of others. So, in other words, young people nowadays, we are not only hypercritical towards ourselves, but we also think everyone's being hypercritical towards us, and then we're also hypercritical towards other people, which is just so fun. So this was a cross-generational study, so these findings are pretty insightful, especially this one, which I will be quoting directly from the paper that came out of the study. There is growing evidence that the increase in psychological ill health of young people may stem from the excessive standards that they hold for themselves and the harsh self-punishment they routinely engage in. Increasingly, young people hold irrational ideals for themselves, ideals that manifest in unrealistic expectations for academic and professional achievement, how they should look, and what they should own. Young people are seemingly internalizing a preeminent contemporary myth that things, including themselves, should be perfect. So what's fun about these young people is that most of these young people in this study are either super young adults or older adults, and so this way of thinking has just formed a loop because we've just been passing it on to the other generations who come after us. Now, perfectionism too does not exist as a single entity. There's different kinds of it too. Specifically, psychologists Paul Hewitt and Gordon Flett developed a multidimensional perfectionism scale to describe the three subscales that perfectionism exists as. The first subscale is self-oriented perfectionism. This is a kind of perfectionism where you hold yourself to a very high standard and you're strongly motivated to attain perfectionism and avoid failure. And then you evaluate yourself very critically. The second subscale is other-oriented perfectionism. This is the belief where you hold other people to a very high standard, specifically your significant other, co-workers, and children. You evaluate these people very, very strictly. And then the third subscale, which is socially prescribed perfectionism. This kind of perfectionism believes that the people around them are holding them to a very, very high standard that they just cannot live up to. This kind of perfectionism causes people to experience external pressure based on their belief that other people are evaluating them very strictly. In Thomas Curran and Andrew P. Hill's research, they found that socially prescribed perfectionism, that's the one where you think everyone else is holding you to a ridiculously high standard, has increased at twice the rate of the other two kinds of perfectionisms. It also found that this form of perfectionism exhibits the largest association with mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, social phobia, and of people having thoughts of unaliving themselves. So where does this kind of thinking come from? I think because we live in a meritocracy, it's very easy to compare ourselves to other people and become incredibly critical of the way we are. But also because we live in a meritocracy, it's very easy for us to think that other people are holding us to really high standards and forcing ourselves to have to live up to that. And I'm sure the perfectionisms like socially prescribed perfectionism and self-perfectionism, both the one where you think everyone's holding you to a ridiculously high standard, but also the one where you hold yourself at a ridiculously high standard, are even more enabled in these incredibly competitive and capitalistic environments that we now live in, where you feel like you have to be the best in order to be able to to survive these harsh economic conditions, but it's definitely probably enabled when oftentimes we might be able to survive better just because we're so perfectionist. And obviously over here, I'm not accounting for nepotism because that is the single best tool anyone could have in this environment. Now, in this kind of environment where it's so easy to breed perfectionism, how are you expected to enjoy a casual hobby when you've been sharpened to evaluate everything you do in terms of, can I be good enough at this? Am I good enough at this? Could I become the best at this? How are you supposed to just be okay with doing something because you enjoy it when you've been tuned to evaluate yourself so critically, and when the capitalistic environment we lived in has enabled you to think like this for your entire life? How are you supposed to enjoy publicly learning something when socially prescribed perfectionism exists? Maybe this is why I felt so much pressure to make the best YouTube video I possibly could. Maybe I'm a big socially oriented and socially prescribed perfectionist. Actually, not maybe, I'm pretty sure I am. I think in online spaces like social media, we can definitely see socially prescribed perfectionism flourish. Because there are some people who I think are on these platforms who have a very high standard for what they're interacting with, who definitely are not afraid to voice when they disagree with you, which is okay when it's just a disagreement, but they're not afraid to voice when people do not hold up to their standards. And if you're seeing this all the time when you're just starting on a hobby, there might be a point where you may not want to enjoy your hobby publicly anymore because you feel like people are going to be very critical towards you. And so socially prescribed perfectionism definitely plays a role in this. Putting the socially prescribed perfectionism aside, it's also very easy for us to participate in self-oriented perfectionism. Am I good enough to do this hobby? Do people think I'm good enough to do it? Can I put it out there when there's so many people who are better than me at it? We can often become very critical of the way we're doing our hobbies ourselves, especially if we're not becoming good at it at the same rate that we hoped we become good at it. Has socially prescribed perfectionism impacted us so deeply that we're afraid of any evaluation and critical thinking at all? I think maybe if you're someone who wants to pursue something like YouTube or TikTok and you see this kind of criticism, it does discourage you from pursuing them unless you feel like you're perfect at it, which is impossible if you were never even given a chance to start. But also I can totally see if like all of these components can lead people to become a lot more critical of what they're producing themselves. Because if we've been bred to believe in meritocracy and that our merits lead to us being good, then I definitely feel like we've bred self-oriented perfectionism so much, because in a meritocracy, if you become really good at your skills, it'll take you far. So you become used to trying to become the best at the very basic things you're learning in the first place, where you have to usually encounter competition, which are schools. And so if that's the way you're kind of tuned to think since you're very small, I can totally see how difficult it is as an adult or as like a young adult to become very critical of the hobbies you're trying to learn, or even like the skills you're trying to learn for fun and not to have any economic output. I guess what I'm trying to say is I can totally see how so many of us have ended up becoming self-oriented perfectionists, which is terrible, because this kind of perfectionism not only has a long list of mental health issues associated with it, if it gets a little too extreme, it also forbids people from growing into their skills at all, especially when we pair it with socially prescribed perfectionism. If all of us just keep comparing ourselves and get really critical of other people to a point where we're critical of everyone, when do we allow people to be bad at things before they can become good? But also, if we take away the space for people to grow and develop from because of perfectionism and capitalism, when are we even allowed to enjoy things? Now, remember at the beginning of this video, I said that two things happened while I was gone? We discussed the first thing, but let's go back to the beginning so that we can also talk about the second thing. Okay, to understand why I reacted this way, here's a little bit of a backstory. A year ago, I made a YouTube video in that I spoke about how I thought Instagram poetry wasn't the best representation of modern day poetry because I found it, in my opinion, too reductive and simplistic. I even included some poetry from popular Instagram poets, some of whose work I did like myself, but could totally see how the criticism I was talking about could be applied to their work too. At first, when I thought no one was watching, I was alright. But then over time, I started to think a little more about what I had said, and I realized that the more people were watching the video, the more something about that video started to bother me. I started thinking about questions like, am I stopping people from enjoying things? Like, this comic here shows. Like, is that me? Am I doing that? Am I the one who needs to be stopped and needs to be told, let people enjoy things? Another question I thought of is, am I actively discouraging people from allowing themselves to just enjoy their hobbies without evaluating themselves too harshly against the standards that I was setting or I was perpetuating? And I couldn't stop thinking about these questions, because even though I do continue to agree with some of the points I'd spoken about in that YouTube video, I can't help but wish that I'd stressed a little harder on how my interpretation of art is my own, because things like poetry are so subjective, and so it's also okay to like things that I might think are bad poetry. Just because I'm saying they're bad, that doesn't mean they necessarily need to be bad or that you need to not like them. Also, because I have totally written things that I would have classified as bad poetry in that video too. In fact, I started writing poetry when I was 16 based on the poems I found on Tumblr, because I was obsessed with Tumblr poetry, and a lot of Tumblr poetry reads kind of like precursors to current day Instagram poetry. But because I was able to write that in a place where I wasn't being judged much, because I did not have a lot of Tumblr followers on that poetry account, and so I had the space to grow as I was writing my poems, I was able to develop my skills and write them in a way that I like much better than the way I was initially writing. I was able to develop my skill according to my own standards. I think there needs a space where people have the ability to grow and improve online. And if anything, a space where they're just allowed to be average at something that they enjoy doing. By pushing this perfectionist mentality, I fear that we're reducing everything to just bad and good and causing the death of just being average. Like, if everyone can only be really good or really bad at anything, then is anyone allowed to just be average at something? And for something like a hobby, can we not just be average at it or even bad? And do we even need to be classified as too good or too bad at doing something for us to just be able to do it? While I understand how competition in our current capitalistic environments has pushed us to become like this, we also need to start reconsidering how we're allowing this mentality to encroach upon spaces where it doesn't need to be. Like, why do we have to be good at everything we do? Like, are we not allowed to just do something because we want to do it? Are we not allowed to do something at all if we're bad at it? Every year, I try to learn a new skill. It's a new thing I try to do so that I feel less like a cog in the machine and more like a person who's living their life meaningfully, or at least enriching it in some sort of way. Well, last year I decided I would learn how to crochet, and while it was fun, I was really bad at it at first. Sometimes I misread instructions and would have to undo my entire project, or sometimes there was too much tension in my stitches, and so the things I was making would end up in strange shapes that they were not supposed to be in. If you would have seen my projects, it would have been a perfect excuse to be incredibly critical of what I was creating, because they were not very good and I made so many mistakes while I was doing them. But instead of criticism, what I found was an online community of incredibly supportive fellow crocheters who were very helpful, kind, and did not gatekeep anything. In fact, you can find so much free resources online because of all these crocheters who work so hard not to gatekeep stuff. They gave me the tools and the resource I needed to grow. And when I asked questions to these crocheters online, I wasn't shamed for how dumb my question was, or wasn't even shamed for the mistakes I'd made. Instead, I was encouraged and told that it was okay if I was making these mistakes. It was totally normal. And also, a mistake is always something that can be fixed. Because contrary to the way I was thinking, a mistaken stitch is just a stitch. You can always unstitch it, you can always recrochet this, and it is not the end of the world. And so I did not need to be so critical of myself as I was making these mistakes. And I think because I was allowed this environment and given this kind of encouragement, I was able to better develop my skills and grow as a crocheter. Sure, I'm not like the world's #1 crocheter now, but I think I've definitely come quite far and actually like what I'm making now. This entire process made me think back to the video I had posted and how if I was 16 and had seen that video when I was writing Tumblr poetry, I might have been too afraid to post my own work or write the pieces that were bad but were very important for me to develop my skill. I like the video I made, and I do agree with several of the points I did mention, but I truly hope that that video did not discourage anyone from writing their own poetry, allowing themselves to not be the single best poet who has ever existed, because that person does not exist. And I hope that that video did not stop anyone from growing or even continuing to like some of the poets I was critical towards. I guess what I mean to say is, do what you enjoy, allow yourself to be bad at it. It's okay to not be great, but it's also okay and even necessary to be okay with that. I truly believe that all of us inherently require a space to grow. All of us need a period of time in our lives where we do things we're not necessarily good at in order to become good at those things. So many of the things we do on a daily basis, we're only able to do them because we were given the space to be able to get very good at them, either through college or school or even as children. If we think about the smallest activities that we do every day, the entire reason you were even able to click on this video and watch it and react to it was because the first time you interacted with the internet, you were given the space to figure out how to use it, or you learned it in school. So you were given a period of time where you were not very good at it before you got good enough at it. Then now you don't even have to think when you're using the internet. YouTube and TikTok wouldn't have been able to become the platform that they're famous for being today without their initial growing days, where people were just posting whatever they wanted on them, without too much harsh judgment or criticism from the people watching them, because no one really expected everyone to be a professional. And to grow on that idea, if Chicken wasn't given the space to learn how to walk again, how could she have become the unofficial track star of my household? And maybe this is actually something I need to realize myself too, so those two scenarios that this whole video focuses on won't happen again. Actually, maybe for the second scenario, I'll have to put a little more effort in order for it not to happen again. But for the first scenario, maybe it's a question of me just toning down my perfectionist tendencies. And as I close this video, I'd like to ask you, is there anything that you're putting off out of fear that you won't be able to do it as well as you think you should, or as perfectly as you think other people expect you to do it? I hope my own struggle and the points I spoke about today will give you the strength to be able to explore where this fear is coming from, or maybe even work through that fear. I hope the points I spoke about help give you the space and the strength to do what you want to do. But perhaps we're also not the greatest judge of what's good or what's not when human opinion is so subjective to who's giving it. Just do something because you enjoy doing it. Because hey, for most of human history, before the agricultural revolution and stuff and barter system, people just did things. They just did it. They didn't really think if it was good or not. They just did something. And so we should continue that. Because you know what? I didn't mention this earlier, but I just realized that way back when, in prehistoric times and stuff, we were able to tell if something was good for humans, like if a berry was good for humans, or like, cow's milk and all that interesting stuff, because we just did things. We did not sit in question and be like, oh, do I need to be the best at doing this? You're like, no, I'm just gonna go and paint on this cave wall because I want to tell the world I was here, and I do not care if it is the best painting or the worst painting. I'll just do it because I want to do it. And you know what? Let's bring back the prehistoric urge to do just because you want to. That should be the real takeaway from this video. But hey, that is all. Thank you so much for watching this video. I apologize if my audio sounds kind of strange at times. I forgot to turn this mic on. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely day, and 1 like equals to 1 more of us succumbing to the prehistoric urge to just do what we want, because we should do that. So in a way, you're just helping other people by liking this video. I'm just kidding. Like this video if you like. Leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what I spoke on today, and if you can elaborate on any idea or have a different perspective, I'd love to hear it. So always have a lovely day, and I will actually be seeing you very soon. For sure this time. Bye!